we're going kind of in a completely different direction. So this is actually work from well over a year ago when we had a sort of sub-working group around program assessment. And so we have a report. I don't know if it ever got posted somewhere where people can actually access it, but I'm going to give you the vast majority of it in this presentation, and then maybe Renata or someone from the South Hub to get the document posted somewhere. So if people want to see it or read it, they can sort of work from there. So what I'm going to run through is sort of a scope, what we actually sort of ended up coming up with as our approach and recommendation for assessment, and then how you might go about developing that locally in place, and then some other pieces. So the subgroup originally was tasked with this idea and sort of came out of my struggle with recognizing that we have to have program assessment that is useful for developing and growing programs, but then also the fact that because data science is new and because lots of places are sort of standing up these programs and don't have the space to build out a productive assessment model, asking questions of can we come up with stuff that is shareable across institutions for sort of successfully modeling and successfully putting out assessment tools, and or rather program level assessment. And so we talked as a committee through a couple of different topics, such as thinking about the really technical outcomes, things around professional outcomes, and then things around dispositions. And so this is sort of mapping to some of the things that the ACM has produced in terms of curricular guidelines, but then also sort of thinking holistically about what we were sort of producing as programs. Nope. Hang on. I don't know why we're not getting it. Oh, there it is. Okay. I just didn't click enough, right? So to start with, we really looked at, we took the committees groups and looked at what learning outcomes we had in place in terms of programs that were stood up in some other places, and sort of recognizing the fact that ACM had already put out guidelines, particularly mostly around the technical outcomes, but also sort of mentioning in for things, some of the other stuff. The places that we sort of thought many faculty or many departments might be a little bit struggling more on is both communication and ethics. And so we wanted to sort of focus for our work on those two. In that vein, we felt that the communication at least would have already more defined things. So we sort of narrowed in on that. And what you see here now is the 4 learning outcomes that we had pulled from existing programs that we were all part of. And we did look out to some other programs, et cetera, but these were the ones that were focused on undergrad programs and explicitly articulated communication. So I'll give you all a second to sort of read through the 4 that are out there. So as a committee, we decided to try to write something that we felt was generic and sort of covered everything. And if you read that learning outcome, you will say, wow, that's a lot, and you can't actually assess it. And that's true. I've recently been working with my department to sort of revision our outcomes. And we started here and then I said, well, we need to sort of trim this down a little bit and focus it because this is in some sense too encompassing. But for our purposes for this working group, we felt that we wanted something as inclusive as possible so that we could make sure that whatever assessment recommendations we came up with would be adaptable to whatever a program might choose to actually focus on in their work. So So in that outcome, you can see that we really were trying to capture all of the things around working with data in terms of talking about the data, the models, the analysis, all the pieces. We also wanted to make sure that we were providing all of the ways that we could approach and look at those questions. In addition, also tackling all of the different, modalities of communication. And so we had to ask then, how do we actually assess this, and how do we go about building something that might show that students are achieving this? So this is sort of the one slide that if you just remember one slide, here it is. Here's what you should take away from the rest of the rest of this, and we're going to sort of dive into more details. But the group came up with that outcome. So communicate about data models, methods, and results of analysis, including use of appropriate context, limitations, and biases. The audiences of varying technical expertise through written, oral, and visual notes. The summary of what we sort of recommended then for the assessment process, and I'm going to go into examples and details in just a moment, is to define out categories of communication skills and practices. So what we mean by that is that outcome covers a lot of stuff, especially that varying technical expertise. And so sort of thinking about how you can break that down into different chunks of sort of more narrowed skill sets. Okay. Then working with those categories, we think that probably the best way to show and have an accessible, actionable item is to have students be building out a portfolio as they work through their program around communication artifacts and the various different modalities. So that might be things like code, that might be things like presentations, it might be things like written reports or research reports or things like that. And then sort of following a sort of a standard assessment process then is that these portfolios upon graduation or as you work through are assessed through standardized rubrics that aren't necessarily tied to the classes themselves, but are tied to looking at the outcomes that you want for your program. And I don't know that this is any earth-shatteringly shocking recommendation here. I think that the thing that perhaps is a little different from when we think about the technical expertise is that we're not thinking here of giving students a test or a single point of assessment. We're really trying to articulate that we want to be collecting assessment items throughout a couple different ways. And then also that these are not really a definitive like, oh, have we hit a bar or not? The rubrics will guide us in saying, well, maybe we've achieved the goal that we want, but they're not really, it's not like we can't just look at a statistic and say, oh, well, this is clearly a success or not. So how do we build out this into more detail? So the approach the group planned on in looking at the literature that's out there around thinking about data science and skill sets that students with data science or data analytics that might have. We end up sort of breaking down these communication goals into two different dimensions, domain expertise or no domain expertise, and then on the other dimension, coding expertise or data expertise, and then little and none. And with those two dimensions, we felt like we were able to capture the vast majority of sort of groups of people that we might expect a student in their workplace to then go and engage with. So you could think about that as being immediate peers in data science teams or other scientists. Those are people that are probably working with specific domain expertise and coding and data expertise. Think about them working directly with deployment and software experts that are their goal is to deploy the machine learning that a data scientist might develop, or that might be turning that into something that is posted on a web page for other people to engage with, et cetera. And so those are people that are probably not coming in with a lot of domain expertise, but might have even more coding or data expertise. You could also think about them working with perhaps bosses that are far above them that have a whole bunch of domain expertise in whatever they're working in, but maybe have no or little coding expertise, thinking of that as sort of company leaders or whatever, which is not to say that leaders don't have data expertise, but very broad sweeping strokes of examples. You could also think about this as being data science experts in a team where the person is joining a team as the data science expert or the coding expert, and they're working with scientists that simply don't have time because they've developed a deep expertise in their domain. And that could be any kind of domain that you're talking about, right? Like this is kind of a common modality that we see at a lot of research schools, et cetera, where they're bringing together a diverse group and they're hiring in people to do certain components that they have no skill set with. And then finally, there's the general, we sort of label this as general public, but you can think of lots of other people that might fit into this, right? People that aren't living in this technical world, either technical in terms of coding and data or coding and in terms of domain. So thinking around those dimensions and aspects, we worked through actually a whole long list of artifacts that we might think students would create, which ended up kind of being categorized into a whole bunch of chunks. Thinking here where what kinds of materials, what kind of communication artifacts are students potentially creating that then they might share, or we might be able to assess and ask these questions of have they developed good communication skills for that particular target audience. And so here we've got a list. You could think directly from code and documentation. So this is really a technical side, which is really falling on that first row. You could think about things like data maps or storyboards, presentations, infographics, or things like providing peer review directly is placed there. So I'm getting a couple questions in the chat, and I will say, Urban, I think we, as I'm reading this, we probably should have some sort of written paper, etc. And I know that was part of our conversation about things like white papers and like presenting white papers, written objects, and things like that. And it'll show up in the next one. As I'm reading this list though of portfolio context, I'm not really sure. I agree, it didn't actually show. It doesn't quite show up there, and I'm not sure if that was just I missed copying something onto the presentation or something else. And then Ray. So yeah, the top level is sort of like specialists versus generalists. Software developers is meant to give you an insight of what might fall into that category without necessarily being explicit. Like that B category, those examples there are meant to give you an insight, not necessarily assume that is exactly what we would be talking to, right? So I assume that there are other categories of people that we might articulate as having coding or data expertise, but not necessarily having domain expertise. So sort of to get into that question that Urban raised, here is a couple of items that we might put together as a sample assessment for a program. And then we can think about where those all fit. Since I want to make sure I get through the next couple of slides. So rather than, I would have asked you all to think about where these fit, but actually I'll give you like 30 seconds. Think about where each of these items might fit into the categories of communication we talked about, right? I talked about. So if we walk through these, right, a persuasive essay on ethics of a new data software product, that probably is falling into, so let me put up text. In my mind, that falls into things like leaders and scientists and general public. So I have sort of a primary and a secondary category up here. And again, these are debatable. There's not a clear answer here. But the point is to highlight that by having a couple of items, we can sort of hit a portfolio perspective can hit different categories of these communication requests. Something like a project management plan is probably being primarily shared with data scientists or data teams, or possibly with the people that are actually implementing code. Some sort of infographic around that might come out of a visualization course might be primarily for the general public, but then could also be aimed at leaders, etc. And if we're talking about something like a documentation package, that's probably actually aimed more at people that are focused on coding skills and sort of supplementing that to people that are in teams that are working with domain expertise. So in terms of taking this idea of a portfolio perspective and asking how does this actually fit into individualized programs, because not every program is the same or has the same emphasis. We provided a couple of guidance questions and ideas for people to work through as they implement this in their own program. So the first two sort of are high level considerations to ask, and this sort of Ray, this maybe addresses yours. I don't know. It might be an offensive way to state it, that it's saying no domain expertise. Our goal here, right, is to be as clear as possible without providing offense. And there are people that don't have domain expertise, whether we talk about that as expert or not expert or something else. I think there still has to be a recognition that people have different knowledge levels and different sort of topics. So if this idea of working with a 2x2 grid helps us clarify the components that we want to focus on. The committee felt that sort of that axis of coding and data expertise made sense and domain expertise made sense, but your program might be interested and focus on more on other things. I think equally important is raising questions around, do elements in that grid need different weighting or importance as you work through your program and how that's implemented. I could easily see something like a highly technical data science program perhaps having less emphasis on the public facing component. Or you could possibly think about sort of like a master's in business analytics, maybe having way more emphasis on that public facing in the leader row, that bottom, the lower coding skill, and a lot less emphasis up on the software development side. So thinking about the fact that different programs and places of implementation might want to have more items in a portfolio around different topics, or you might want to consider not even assessing certain components because that's not what their actual goal is. The idea, though, was to help provide programs a way of thinking around where those communication needs might fit. In terms of direct implementation, so I showed that example of a list of a couple of different portfolio items that you might choose. Here's our sort of recommended idea for how to go about finding what those might fit. And again, it's not rocket science here. We're sort of suggesting, look at your classes, think about what source of courses, particularly required courses, as we're building on an assessment product, occur already in your program, and then look at the kinds of assignments that come out of it. Don't look to be producing new assignments in it unless you can't find things. And then look for artifacts that might fit into different grid cells so that you can then collect those. I think one of the important things to remind people that aren't used to doing an assessment process is that you should probably be developing independent rubrics outside of the class's assessment of those products that are around the program ideas and questions that you want to say, because you don't want your program level assessment to be impacting students' grades. That's not what a program level assessment is. A program level assessment is to say, are we achieving our goals in our education process? Okay. And then sort of a reminder in this process is to take that step back and make sure that your actual plan fits the needs and has buy-in, really, right? So have you got rubrics that go with your goals? Have you actually picked things that you can collect for a program to assess? And then have you really checked in with your stakeholders? And stakeholders here is very broad. We could be talking about everything from students to administrators and really also equally important, other colleagues in the department if they aren't part of your assessment development process. Okay. From a higher level, we wanted to sort of remind people developing assessment that it's not just about assessing a program level outcome and seeing whether that program is being achieved or not, but a good program design goes further and says, well, are the outcomes that we're getting from these assessments, from these rubric items, providing us something actionable and changeable in our program? Or is it just telling us whether we did or didn't do something? Equally valuable in that sort of education assessment process is asking, are there points that you can assess early and late? Because if you simply assess late, you're not necessarily seeing whether students have grown any in your program. You're simply saying, do they have these skills? Okay. Which, if they don't have the skills, then you know you're not doing anything. But if they have the skills, you don't have any evidence from your program that says, oh, the program taught them this. Maybe they picked it up somewhere else or before they even got to your program. The last two questions I think are also relevant for us as program designers to think carefully about is, are the students actually learning these practices to do this? And are you actually teaching them explicitly? Or is this sort of expected inference through osmosis or practice? Right. Sort of wrapping up, this is a really high level sort of like, hey, here's an idea for starting and making sure that people, if they don't have any assessment plans or haven't figured out how they plan to assess, can sort of pick it up, put it in place and say, well, at least we've got something to start from. The working group would love to have had time to develop out sample rubrics and have example items and things like that so people could pick those up. We didn't have time, but I think that's a next step that would be productive for either a working group or some other research process to do. I think in hindsight, if we can simplify or figure out a way to break that generalized program learning outcome down more, it would be really helpful for other programs in terms of replication. There's also not really anything for comparing across programs if we build out these sort of portfolio things, unless we get standardized rubrics or things that could then be applied at multiple programs. There's obviously some more work around other topics for building out sort of recommendations for assessments, particularly the ethics and professional practices sort of fits into this, but we could also think about perhaps generalized problem solving or applications. All right, and we are at 11, so I'm going to say thank you for listening, and I don't know how far Renata has scheduled us time out. I'll throw up one last quick plug. We are running a workshop around education for data for good for education in July out of Trinity in the Midwest. If you want more, I'm happy to talk about that later and answer questions.
Thank you, Karl. If there's questions, you can also add your questions to Etherpad. Any of these links, also Rachel and Karl, if you want to put the links in the Etherpad, we'll keep those open so that way people can directly assess them. That would be great. Also, I know we're at the end, but we have been thinking about this, so we really wanted the sub-working groups to come back. So we've already been working with one of our other sub-working group, which was on project-based teaching, to extend these out into longer or larger projects. So if your working group is interested in that, if there's other people that are interested in, actually applying for awards to try to get some of these things done at multiple institutions, you can reach out to me and we can try to work with us, because we want to be sure that we are also being good stewards and implementing some of these ideas if there are places that are using them, and that we can try and foster that going forward. So we were looking forward to this group being able to present. So if there are, I think we have maybe like 1 or 2 questions, please put yours in the Etherpad too if we don't get to them, because I will ask the speakers. The Etherpad will stay live till the end of the day. And you can answer questions directly there because you can directly type and answer anyone's questions. So let me look at the chat. Is there anyone that has, an initial question, like kind of a final question, and then we can break and get back together and cycle back?
Okay. Oh, you know what? Irvin, I think what I missed and where we missed the written part was in, apparently when I put it on my slide, I put client-facing presentation. And in our text, we have client-facing presentation or report, thinking about the idea that sort of those reports that headed out to clients could be a written or a white paper or sort of research publication. But I'm going to still add in more written because that's clearly not there.
Yeah. And for the people who joined later, I want to be sure that you also have access, as someone said, they need access to the Etherpad. So if you joined a little bit later, I'll put that link back in there. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, you can go ahead and.
Ray, I'm open if you have better suggestions for how to sort of articulate that other axis of little to or no domain expertise. I get where you're coming from. We're saying, hey, saying someone has no domain expertise could be considered offensive. I mean, I guess in some sense it's an internal document, but I don't know what other, like.
I mean, I think generalist specialist, like you said, maybe just generalist specialist would work. But if it doesn't, ask me, because I love naming things. I'll try to come up with something.
Sure. No, that makes, yeah, you can talk about like a domain generalist or a specialist. Yeah.
I mean, the general public, they all have domain expertise. It's just a matter of what. So if you said which domain expertise you're talking about, that would also be helpful.
Right.
You know, but there's not a lot of room there. So that's why I was just trying to think of like easy one word things that might be good enough.
Yeah, I think the reason we wanted, I get, yeah, there's no specification around domain there. The intent, I think, being that whenever you start articulating what the domain is, then you start having, like you said, the general public has a specific domain, and so we can't articulate what domain it is, but it's different people fall into different categories. So, yeah.
We have the same comment with the non-STEM as well. And so, Aaron, yes, time zones get mixed up. So anyone that needs to go, they were at the end, you feel free to go.